Hello. Today we're going to be in Joshua 5 and 6. I hope you'll get your Bible and follow with us. Chapter 5 verses 1 through 12 is a little more detail about what happened at Gilgal, particularly in relationship to two very important rituals that had to do with the covenant of Yahweh going clear back to Abraham. One of those is circumcision. That, of course, was initiated with Abraham. And the other is the Passover, which, of course, was initiated by Moses in Exodus 12 as they came out of Egypt. There's going to be a real parallel between the things that God did for Moses and how he did them and some of the things that God's going to do for Joshua. In this chapter, we have that same kind of parallelism with Joshua meeting the angel of the Lord in verses 13 through 15 and him having to remove his sandals because he's on holy ground. It's an obvious parallel back to how God met Moses at the burning bush. Let's look at this chapter then, if we could. Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites, now of course the kings of in this chapter refer to the city-states. The land of Canaan was much like the land of Greece in the fact that cities controlled certain areas. Now the word Amorite means Highlander. These people lived in the hill country, and they're mentioned quite often in the Bible as being in this hill country. You might want to see Numbers 13:29, Deuteronomy 1 verse 7 and verse 20, and Joshua 10:6. And then we're beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites. And the Canaanites is another term like Amorites that can be a collective term for all the Canaanite tribes. These folks lived along the coastline and were considered lowlanders. And notice it says here, who lived by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they crossed. How did they know that? Were there spies watching on the other side? Well, I don't know, but they knew about it because we have heard several times what happened here, how their hearts melted and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. We heard that back in chapter 2 verse 11, where Rahab told the spies that. This same phraseology is mentioned in chapter 4 verse 24. I think when you see this lack of spirit on the part of the Canaanites to resist the Israelites, you see why they allowed themselves to be circumcised in this passage. Why would they let themselves be circumcised where the men could not fight for several days? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, they were pretty secure because of the Canaanites' fear. And number two, some of them were circumcised. You see, all those who were under 20 were still alive, and all of those children had been circumcised from the 8th day. It's the group that were born in the wilderness that were not circumcised. Now, at that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make for yourself flint knives." Now, why flint knives? Well, flint knives, I'm sure the way Abraham did it, they had metal by this time. Maybe for medical reasons they didn't use the metal. We learn even today that some doctors still operate with these obsidian blades because they're so sharp. And so maybe that's why they use these flint knives. These flint knives are mentioned in Exodus chapter 4 verse 25, and you might want to look at that. And they circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeah. Now this Gibeath. This Gibeath means the hill of the foreskins. So obviously the men went away from the camp and circumcised each other in a place kind of off by themselves, and the name of this geographical location was called this. And so it got the name from this. It wasn't always named this. It's amazing to me that this whole example, if you look at the Septuagint of Joshua 24:30, says that all of these flint knives were buried with Joshua when he died. That's not in the Masoretic text, but it's in the Greek translation. And then notice it says, and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. Now this second time is not in the Greek translation of the Bible, and it really literally is to return again to. I don't think it refers to a second circumcision. That's kind of hard to do. But I think it refers to return again to a state of being completely circumcised, and I think that's what it's for. Now, of course, circumcision was a sign given to Abraham as a sign of the covenant. All the people around Israel circumcised their children except the Philistines. Some of them did it, when they were in puberty is when most of them did it. It's kind of a rite of passage from childhood to manhood. But all of the other nations circumcised, but Israel circumcised early for religious purposes. And we learn from parts of the book of Deuteronomy that it seems to be a symbol of cutting off of the wickedness from a person's heart. It'll talk about circumcising your heart, circumcising your lips, circumcising your ear. It's a way of being open to God, might be a good symbol of that. And Joshua made himself flint knives. Let me ask you, did Joshua circumcise all these people himself? Did Joshua make all the flint knives? Oh, I think not. There are just thousands and thousands and thousands of folks had this done to. I think he used either the elders or these officers some way, or maybe the men who were already circumcised. He's got to have some help. It's just too many folks here. Let's see. By the way, I want to mention to you that circumcision in beginning in verse 2 and down through about verse 8 is really preparatory for the Passover. For we learn from Exodus 12:48 that no one can take the Passover unless they're circumcised. So the circumcision is reminding them of the Abrahamic covenant, and the Passover, which is preparatory to, is reminding them of the Mosaic covenant. For some reason, they had not observed the Passover these years of wanderings. It's going to be the first time, apparently, in a long time, and they're excited about it, but they had to prepare themselves. Okay, let's see. And this is the reason that why Joshua circumcised them, and all the men who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war. Now, when it says men of war, it simply means the men that are over 20 years old and capable of battle. That's what it's referring to. Died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. And there we get the full explanation. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished, because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord their God. Now that's very important. Remember the spies, he sent them in, they didn't believe, and then God said, well, I'm going to make you wander. They said, oh, no, we're wrong, we're going to go take it now. And then they got defeated by those Canaanite tribes. So it was punishment. Now these people had showed faith by crossing this Jordan River at full tide. Notice it's a land that he swore to his fathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. I want to say to you that this is exactly what God promised back in Abraham chapter 12. He promised it again in 15. He promised it again in 17. He promised it again in 21. He promised Isaac. He promised Jacob. He promised Moses. He promised the children of Israel. Now's the time. God's going to fulfill his promise. A land flowing with milk and honey, that's a very interesting name. We learn from the ancient documents, I think both Assyrian and Persian, this was not just a description of the land, but the actual title these people used for the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. And their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised. Now again, not him, but others as his representative. And they were, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them along the way. Why? We just don't know. Now it came about that when they finished circumcising all the nation, that they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. This is the literal word, Hebrew word life, but it means healed. Now it seems when you compare chapter 19 with 5:10, we're only talking about 3 days. But folks, that is not enough time to heal from circumcision. So obviously there's some chronological gaps through here. Exactly where there are, we're not sure. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Now, what is this reproach? Well, some say that you were uncircumcised. Some say you were slaves back in Egypt. But I think it's something else. It's this reproach that is mentioned so often in the Pentateuch about that the Egyptians heard what God did to his own people, and they kind of mocked at the children of Israel. You might want to see Exodus 32:12, Numbers 14:13 through 16, Deuteronomy 9:28 is I think the thing that the reproach is going to be taken away from, that God was going to bless his people and not judge them, as it seemed he was doing. So the name of the place is called Gilgal. Now Gilgal means a circle or a wheel. There's a play on the word between rolled away and this circle named Gilgal, their first camping site that became a very important sanctuary, religious sanctuary in the days ahead. While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month. And that's exactly 4 days from when they entered the Promised Land. So when the circumcision occurred, I'm not real sure. And on the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. Now the reason that's so important, this unleavened cakes, of course, shows you that back in Exodus chapter 12, the one-day feast of Passover is linked to the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. So apparently they again observe this feast of unleavened bread because that's what they're eating the day after the Passover. I also want to remind you in verse 12 that the manna ceased on that day. God said it would back in Exodus 16:35, and this, of course, is a fulfillment of that as they begin to eat of the Promised Land. They had no more need of manna, which, whether it was done by natural means or not, the timing is supernatural. It started at appropriate time. It stopped at an exact time. They couldn't do it on the Sabbath. It didn't come that day. So it's really maybe natural means, but supernatural timing. Now in verse 13 through 15, just a very strange account, but really sets the stage for chapter 6. Now it came about when Joshua was near Jericho. Now the Hebrew word for preposition is very loose here. It could be in or by or near or something like that. Jericho, that was the major fortification that was very close to where they crossed the Jordan. That he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man. Now this is not the word for Adam that's usually translated man. This is the word for ish, can mean a person, because this man is going to be an angel. Matter of fact, I think this man is going to be the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, and I'll show that to you a little bit when we get in this text a little more. Was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. Now, where else have we heard that? Well, there was an angel of the Lord with a sword drawn back in the account of Balaam's donkey talking, back in Numbers 22:31. There is also a mention of another angel with a sword drawn in 1 Chronicles 21:16. But this angel is very important. He seems to be a symbol saying to Joshua, I'm going to be with you militarily, Joshua. I'm going to prepare the way as I promised. I will fight for you, which fulfills, of course, the promise of Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 30. And Joshua didn't quite recognize him. Joshua went to meet him and said, are you for us or for you for our adversary? See, this guy looked just like a man. Joshua couldn't tell the difference, but he also couldn't tell if he was a Hebrew or a Canaanite. Now he said, no, rather, I indeed now come as the captain of the host of the Lord. Now the word captain can also mean the word prince. This is the only place in all the Old Testament this phrase appears, the prince of the host of the Lord. Now the word host is another military term that means the armies of God. And of course it's the covenant name for God, Yahweh. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down. Now Joshua recognized that this was a supernatural figure. I don't know if he recognized it was the pre-incarnate Messiah, but he knew it was an angel. And he prostrated himself. Why has my Lord to say to his servant? Now the word he used for Lord here is the word Adonai, which means master, owner, or Lord. And the captain or the prince of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. That's exactly like Moses at the burning bush. The exact same thing was said. Now this removing of the sandals was a sign of worship and reverence and openness to God. And of course the reason that ground was holy is not because it was some special place, but because of the presence of this angelic person that I really think is not an angel at all, but the pre-incarnate Christ. Because back in Exodus chapter 3 verse 5, where it says the angel of the Lord calls the bush to burn, then it says that God spoke to Moses out of the bush. Well, look down in chapter 6 verse 2. You see, we have nothing really recorded of what the angel's message was. I think the angel's message was down here in chapter 6, verse 2, where it says, and Yahweh said to Joshua. And there the parallel is exactly like the burning bush, and I think that's the purpose of this. And that's why I think it is like that. Okay. Now Jericho was tightly shut because the sons of Israel, no one went in or came out. Now these people had, as you know, they built these walled cities for protection. The whole area would have flooded in there. They had food stocks and water. You can imagine how terrified they were when you think back at chapter 2 verse 11 and chapter 5 verse 1, if they had heard all that God had done, not only to the kings on the eastern side of Jordan, but how God had split the Jordan River and let them cross dry shod. And the Lord said to Joshua, now I think this Lord is the angel or the prince mentioned in 13 through 15. I have given Jericho into your hand. That means it's as good as done. I've promised that it's yours. Trust it. Walk in that. With its king, remember a city-state, and its valiant warriors, meaning its men of war. Okay? Now, and you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once, and you shall do so for 6 days. Now, folks, when you read through this, you say, boy, this is not a normal military procedure. You bet your bippy it's not a normal military procedure. Can you imagine what it would be like for us to do a business meeting and present something like this, the way we're going to do something? Everybody would croak. Well, it was an act of obedience to these men. This wasn't a normal thing you do. It was a way for them to say, this doesn't make sense, but I'm going to trust the word of the God that I serve. See, that's the whole thrust. We're to take God at his word, even if we don't understand it, and act in faith. That's pleasing to God. So they're going to march around. They're going to take the ark, and look at the number of times that 7 appears in verse 4. It's going to be 7 priests and 7 trumpets. On the 7th day, you're going to do it 7 times. Number of 7 is the Hebrew number of perfection. We think that got that connotation from back in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where there were 7 days of creation. God did it perfectly and did it completely, and so the number 7 came to have this special connotation of completeness or fullness or perfection. Now, notice these 7 trumpets of ram's horn. This is a zophar in Hebrew. And I was reading some Jewish books that say it was the left horn of a fat-tailed sheep. But I couldn't corroborate that very much. It is interesting to me. The rabbis say it had to be the horn of a sheep or a goat because it reminded the synagogue of the ram that God provided in place for Isaac on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22. And so it's a very special horn. It did not have a musical sound, but just a loud blast. It was used for religious assemblies and sometimes for wars. Now, they're going to march around once every day, and then on the seventh day, around 7 times, they're going to shout and blow the trumpets, and then God's going to give them the victory. They don't know what He's going to do yet. And it shall be that when you make a loud blast with a ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shout with a loud shout. This is a war cry, kind of like us in Texas, remember the Alamo or something. That's the kind of thing they're going to shout when these men of war move right up into the city, each in his own place. And the wall of the city will fall down. Now, the Hebrew here means it will fall under its own weight, is the idea. Now, you say, well, what happened? Well, some people say, wow, it was the shaking of the mortar that broke the bricks. Well, folks, they've been ram's horn blowing now for several days. I don't think you can explain this naturally. God did something supernatural. The timing was there. Now, I've watched the Memorex commercial. I know you can break glass with a certain woman's voice, but this is the double walls of an ancient Canaanite city, which we have learned were built several feet thick and had lasted hundreds and hundreds of years. So I think it's a miracle myself. The people would go up, everyone straight ahead of them. As they marched around the city, the army would surround it, and they'll all go straight up into the city. Now, notice where it says, and Joshua son of Nun called the priest and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant. I was in my class the other day. One of my students said, you know Joshua had no parents? And I said, what? Yes, they said he was son of Nun. It's free for those who give the cooperative program. Now, take up the ark of the covenant, and let the 7 priests carry the 7 trumpets of ram horn before the ark of the Lord. Remember, as they crossed the Jordan, no longer was the Shekinah cloud of glory the symbol of the presence of God, as it had been the wilderness wandering period, but it was the ark of the covenant where God symbolically dwelt between the cherubim. And every year, once a year, on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, the high priest went into that special Holy of Holies and sprinkled blood there for the forgiveness of the people. And it was so that Joshua had spoken to the people, and the 7 priests, carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the Lord, went and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the God followed them. And the armed men went before the priest who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard was there, and you see the kind of the marching order it gave them. Now notice where it says the armed men. Kimchi and Rashi, which are Jewish commentators from the Middle Ages, say that this was the tribe of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh that went before, and the rest went behind. But that's quite true, because back in chapter 1, verses 10, and chapter 3, lost my place, chapter 4, verse 12 and 13, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had to go before their brothers. I missed a point I want to pick back up on in verse 7. Notice where it says, and he said to the people in your Bible. The Masoretic text had, and they said to the people, which would probably be these officers we've been talking about, chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 3, verse 2, because Joshua couldn't speak that loud to all the people. He had to have representatives, elders, or these officers, that kind of like scribes. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you shout. Notice this, the priests could blow these trumpets any time, but the men of war could not say a word all the time they marched around this city for 6 days. Boy, just think of that, they couldn't say a word. But on the 7th day, they're all going to shout the same time that all the horns are blown. Now, sometimes critical scholarship says, look, there's 2 different accounts here. One can make noise and one can't. I don't think that's 2 different accounts. There's 2 different groups. There's a group of priests who can blow the trumpet any time, and a group of soldiers who can't talk. I just really reject this JEDP theory of source criticism. I think it's just the pits, the pure pits. Now, notice in verse 10, now Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, and then you shall shout. It's going to be a loud, loud noise. Now, this silence may be kind of referred to in a kind of oblique way in verse 4, 8, and 13. You might want to note that. So he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once, and then came to the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning. This is very characteristic of the Bible. It's a way of saying they're ready for a journey, they're ready for action, they're getting up, ready to do the Lord's will. And you can read down through this and see they're doing the very same thing he's been telling them to do all the way down here. In verse 17, I want to pick up on the concept, and the city shall be under the ban. This is the Hebrew word harem. It means something devoted to God for destruction. It's so holy it can't be used by people. Now I realize that this holy war bothers people. His holy war is discussed in Genesis 15, 12 and following, and Leviticus 27, 28 and 29. Everything that breathes dies because it all belongs to God. Now we say, oh, that's so cruel, boy. Let me say one thing to you. This was the common way of warfare in that day, when all the nations had their gods, and they did this kind of thing on behalf of their deities. You cannot judge the Old Testament in light of your day. Our own society is very barbaric in its own ways. Example, how we treat our old people, how we murder hundreds of thousands of children before they're born. Let's don't call the Old Testament barbaric when we're as barbaric as they are in other ways. People are going to look at our culture years from now and say, boy, what a bunch of brutal people. We must judge each culture in light of its own day. And remember that. It's going to help you. Now, look, we got mention of old Rahab the harlot here in verse 17. Remember her back in chapter 2? You know, Jewish tradition says that she married Joshua, and that Jeremiah is one of their descendants. Wouldn't that be a racy story? I hope God has all this on videotape. And notice he mentions here in verse 18, now don't you men covet anything in this city. Don't you take the silver or gold or any of the bronze. Don't take anything out of the city. Now this is because it's going to set the stage for chapters 7 and 8, where the Israeli army is going to be defeated. After they take this major city of Jericho, they're going to get beaten by a little bitty city because of sin in the camp. God's got to show his people that he's going to give these cities to them. They're going to have to dress for war. They're going to have to get ready. They're going to have to participate in the battle. But God's going to give it to them if they obey his voice. But the power is in the covenant God. And the covenant God has some conditions on the covenant. And so here's a stipulation preparing the way for chapters 7 and 8 that we'll learn about Achan and how his sin cost the whole Israeli army to be defeated and several men to die. Now, notice verse 21 where it says again, and they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both men and women, young and old, sheep and oxen, donkeys with the edge of the sword. Again, look at Genesis 15:12 and following. This is predicted as the punishment on the Canaanite tribes. Please look at Leviticus 28 and 29. God told them, when you go in there, if you don't kill the Canaanites, they're going to be a thorn in your side. They're going to be a sticker in your eye all of your days. Friends, they didn't do it. And they caused them to get into idolatry. And the miserable failure of the nation of Israel is directly connected with the unobedience of not killing these Canaanite tribes. Now, verse 22. And Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go to the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out there, so as you have sworn to her. Joshua was faithful to the promise they made to Rahab. So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother, her brothers, and all she had, and they brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. Well, why outside the camp? Well, because she's still a Canaanite. She has not officially converted yet. She would still be ceremonially unclean. But if you look down at verse 25, it's obvious that she will be included as a full faith partner. Now, this is one of those unusual people in the Bible, kind of like Melchizedek of Genesis 14. He's not a Hebrew. And Balaam, the prophet, false prophet though he may be, tricked prophet, but he's still a prophet of God. He's not Hebrew. Here we have Rahab. She's not a Hebrew. Ruth's not going to be a Hebrew. God is showing by the inclusion in the line of the Messiah people who are not Jewish to show his inclusive nature. And I think we miss these little jewels when we miss that. The Jews love to talk about Rahab because they say if God can forgive Rahab, God can forgive anybody. And that's very true. She was just a proverb for the forgiveness of God. I think that's beautiful. And they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and pieces of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Now this, of course, refers to the tabernacle. There is no house of the Lord yet. So this is the tabernacle. By the way, I wanted to mention about this ceremonially unclean. Would you please look at Deuteronomy 23:14? It's surprising that a Canaanite got into the family of God anyway. Now, in verse 25, however, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared. Let her live. And she lived in the midst of Israel to this day. Now, this day shows that somebody writing after these events wrote this down. The whole Old Testament has been edited to some extent. Some say that Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, edited it. Some say that Ezra edited it. It's obvious that it was edited. But I say to you, I think it was edited in the will of God. Just because Joshua didn't write Joshua, every bit of it, doesn't mean it's not inspired. I believe the Bible's inspired irregardless of the author or final editor. And that's my faith assumption. Because what it says about God has proved to be true, not only in past history, but in current history and in my own life. Now, verse 26. And Joshua made an oath. Now, an oath means to bring God's name. It doesn't mean to curse. It means to bring God's name into something at that time, saying, "Cursed before Yahweh is the man who raises up and builds the city of Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest son he shall set its gates." Did you know that, of course, Jericho was rebuilt? It's one of the most ancient cities in all the world. I think it has almost 5,000 years of ruins in it. But do you know in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34, it says that Hiel, the Bethite, rebuilt Jericho, and his youngest son died, and his oldest son died, fulfilling completely this prophecy of Joshua. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. It wasn't only fame, it was plumb terror. The Canaanites were scared to death of the Israelis, and of course we'll see that Joshua will use that to his advantage as he encourages the Israelites to prepare for battle, but that God will give them the victory if they obey him. If they don't, the victory will be the Canaanites. You see, I hear people say all the time, well, God's so mean, he took the Canaanites out of the land and gave it to the Jews. Friends, I want to tell you that when the Jews start doing the same things the Canaanites did, the abominations of the Canaanites, God took them out of the land too. That's what the Babylonian exile is all about, the Assyrian exile of the northern 10 tribes. God is faithful. He says, if you obey me, I'll bless you. But if you knowingly break my commands, you're going to pay a price. Now, folks, that's what Joshua 27 and 28 is all about. I think the Old Testament can really be understood in light of Deuteronomy 27 and 28. That's the cursing and the blessing section. Yes, God is faithful to his covenant, but there are some stipulations to the covenant. And we're going to see that, especially in the next 2 chapters, as we look at the terrible defeat at Ai, a little bitty town not too far from Jericho. Not too far. I think God's showing them your power, your strength, your victory is in me, not in yourself. Walk before your God humbly, revere him, obey him, and I will give you the joys of the land, the desires of your heart. And that really is a story of Joshua 5 and 6. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I hope to see you again next week when we study the defeat at Ai. God bless you. Have a day.